We're very, very happy to be here after several months of really, really good work. My job today is not to do the presentation. We have a very expert presenter to do that. I just want to introduce the members of our task force to you, the people that you selected last November. The first position was Riley Stark. Now, Riley, as you know, has several businesses to run, so he may or may not be available today. Jim Dickinson is here. I think some of you know. Patricia Dunn, Finance Director for WTA, while she's not on this task force. Diane Harper is here. Kathy Berg is here. And I'm Barbara Ryan. I'd like to especially introduce Chandler Johnson, who, as you probably know, is finishing his PhD at Stanford and actually does some of this work for a living. Has a presentation that I think will dazzle. Did me, anyway. And after the presentation, if you have questions, we're all here and would enjoy an opportunity to answer any questions that you have. So, Chandler?
Well, dazzling is a bit of a high bar. So recognize.
Excuse me, sir. You will have to use the microphone. Everything you're saying is on the record.
Very good. Is this sufficiently clear?
Yes.
Okay.
And if you could go ahead and introduce yourself once again.
My name is Chandler Johnson, and I'm position number, I'm not sure which, of task force. Anyway, so we're going to go through a presentation today of the task force findings and our recommendations. First, though, we're going to go over, just to give you a little bit of a introduction to what we'll be talking about. I'll give you some background on why we're here, what brought us to this point. Then we'll go through the Ferry budget, explain how that constitutes a baseline for our recommendations. Then we'll go through our recommendations to explain exactly what they are, how they play out, both the quantified and the unquantified recommendations. And finally, we'll talk about some recommendations, some things that we assessed and chose not to pursue. First of all, one of the things to put some flesh on this Ferry thing, if we were to map out ridership based on 2007 volumes, what you'd see is that passenger ridership of needs-based, multi-ride, and cash ridership has fallen almost 20% since 2007. Now, that masks the fact that cash ridership has fallen about 40%, and multi-ride has fallen basically not at all. It's stayed relatively stable. That's significant because those two forms of ticket sales distinguish really between people that live on the island and people that visit the island. About 40 to 50% of all cash sales happen in the summer. Similarly, vehicle sales have also fallen about 20% in the last 4 years, and you see the same breakdown. Cash sales have fallen hugely, multi-ride sales have stayed fairly stable. The other major source of revenue across the ferry is trucks. Truck traffic has fallen about 40%. So to the extent that the evidence fits any sort of hypothesis regarding what's happening on the ferry, we're looking at basically macroeconomic collateral damage. The ferry ridership is falling because people don't have enough money to visit and people aren't building houses. That's what's happening, it seems. Now, to put that next to what's happening with costs, we've seen ferry costs increase about 40% in the last 4 years. Two primary drivers there are increasing repairs and changes in the methods of allocation. So things that used to be in the road fund are now in the ferry fund, and it's costing more and more to put the Whatcom Chief into dry dock, just to give some examples. If we were to marry those things up, one of the fundamental problems is you've got a shrinking ridership pool paying for a larger chunk of costs. So you've got ridership going down and down and down and costs going up and up and up. So that if we looked at what the average person paid, average rider paid to go across that boat in 2007, it was $4.12. By the time you get to 2011, it's budgeted to be $7.76. So from a rider's perspective, there are people that at some point, maybe already, maybe in the near future, can't afford to pay that 80% increase. Similarly, though, costs have increased. The average cost to send somebody across the boat has gone from $8.50 to $15.68. And therein lies the dilemma. The riders look at this red bar. This, the difference between the blue bar and the red bar, is what basically what the road fund ends up paying. So from the road fund's perspective, costs have increased about 84%. So you have riders looking at it saying, I can't pay, and the county looking at it saying, I can't pay either. So one of the fundamental problems is, in order to basically reconcile interests, we have to shrink the blue bar. We have to get total costs down. So what the task force did is, recognizing that we were constrained by existing infrastructure, there's a boat that goes between 2 points. That let's hold constant. And recognizing that we don't have a lot of capacity to change the macroeconomic conditions right now. We can't grow.
Excuse me, when you say macro, you're talking about the recession.
I'm talking about the recession, yeah. So recognizing that we face those constraints, we wanted to identify the least onerous revenue and service solution, meaning what the people that ride the ferry would consider to be the least painful, that would still meet the fare box requirement and reduce the road fund burden. So how do we do all three of those things? Then the rest of the presentation, or the bulk of the remainder of the presentation, goes through the set of things that we came up with that we think will help achieve those goals. So if we were to walk through the ferry budget for 2011, just to illustrate where we're starting. Ferry operations in 2011 are estimated to cost $2.7 million, approximately. There's no capital, because out of Ordinance 89-103 and then in 1034, capital isn't in the, doesn't come out of the ferry fund. So just, if you're wondering why isn't that in there, that's why we didn't look at that. Ferry user fees are expected to cover $1.3 million of the $2.6 million in expense. $2,000 of that expense total is going to be covered by interest on the ferry fund. $160,000 is picked up by the state in the motor vehicle fuel tax. The road fund's going to pick up the other $1.2 million. That's how the ferry is supposed to be funded in 2011. So we've got this other balance or income statement over here, if you will. That's, say, the road fund, sending $1.2 million into the ferry. Now, the road fund gets a separate pool of money, $140,000 from the state, that's attributable to the existence of the ferry. So the net cost, oh, and again, we're not looking at capital here. So the net cost to the road fund for ferry operations is about $1.06 million. From this little graphic, we can summarize in three numbers. We can look at total expenses, total ferry user fees, and total road fund costs. Basic point of the task force was, if we can get that number down, both these numbers will fall. So starting with that baseline, we came up with some recommended changes that you'll find in the booklets that I believe you all have now. The first thing we looked at was, or the largest thing we looked at, I should say, was eliminating parking on Gooseberry Point, in particular that part of parking that's leased from the Lummi Nation. That would save $113,000 a year. It's a combination of security for the parking, maintenance for the parking, and the lease itself. Additionally, big difference. Additionally, we'd expect that that would generate another about $15,000 in revenue, because people that currently are parking, some subset of the people that are currently parking would drive across, which yields slightly more revenue than if they walk. So the net effect of that would be a $77,000 reduction in current ferry user fees and savings to the road fund of $51,000. Similarly, we recommended instituting crew fares. Right now, the crew and their families go across the ferry for free. So we recommend, primarily for transparency reasons, issuing the crew punch cards. That would cost $27,000 a year. Similarly, it would generate revenue of $27,000 a year. Now, this particular recommendation, because of the way the ordinance is written, would benefit ferry user fees to the tune of $12,000, but it would cost the road fund $12 grand. We also recommend reducing service hours, making the last run Sunday through Thursday, a new 10:20 from the island. That would save $50,000 a year, saving the road fund, excuse me, saving the ferry user fees $28,000 and the road fund $22,000. We also recommend.
I think you have it in the wrong place then.
Should save ferry user fees $28,000 and road fund $22,000. Did I say something
You've got
else?
expenses. Oh.
Negative 50?
Oh, I didn't see the negative, sorry.
No problem. If we were to use a one engine, yeah, Bill.
Yeah, in your document, it says that the Coast Guard won't allow you to use one engine, that when it was that way, it says that when we first went to the Whatcom chief, the motors were so inconsistent that a lot of times they were running on one, and it says, even so, the ferry never missed a trip. It simply operated on one engine, a procedure no longer allowed by the Coast Guard on double-ended passenger vessels.
I believe, and maybe I'll defer to Jim, but I believe that the answer is.
Let's do this, Jim. Hold on just a minute. Let's let him finish his presentation. And if
Okay.
you guys could make little notes on the things you have questions, then we'll get into the discussion about the specific items.
At the same time, to follow up on that, if you have questions like Barbara's about sign errors or that kind of thing, please ask them immediately, because any issue of clarification I'd like to deal with on the spot.
On the dollars.
So if it is possible to move to single engine operation, then we estimate that would save $22,000 from ferry user fees and $18,000 from the road fund. If we were to reduce the safety specialist allocation from 25% to 10%, we'd see a net expense reduction of $24,000. Similarly, if we were to implement web-based ticket sales, we would expect to see administrative costs primarily go down by about $5,000. If we change the daily boat prep, by which we mean right now, when the boat starts up in the morning, all 3 crew members go down there to start it up. If we were to only send 2 down to start the boat up, we'd save about $4,000 a year. If we implemented electronic ticketing, so this is right now a guy walks onto the boat, he has to pay in cash or with a punch card. If you were instead to have electronic ticketing where someone could pay with a credit card, that would reduce administrative expenses, reduce data entry. It would reduce printing costs. It would, at the same time, you would incur credit card transaction fees. Accounting for all that, we'd expect a net reduction of about $2,000 in expense and about a $15,000 increase in income. The income increase is because right now, once somebody is on the Whatcom chief, if they don't have the capacity to pay, there's no way to collect. Wow. This is principally an issue. One of the ways that this is an issue is with delivery vehicles that don't know they can't pay with credit card until they get there. So somebody comes from Skagit County to deliver, say, a piece of furniture, they get on the truck or on the boat, and they pull out their credit card, corporate credit card, they can't take it. So we estimated that would generate about another $15,000 a year in income. We also looked at and recommend evaluating rescheduling dry dock. We don't know exactly what this would cost. There are a couple of major expenses that are somewhat fluid, but we expect that it would generate about $7,000 a year in additional revenue. Right now, dry dock happens in September, which is still very heavy tourist season for the Lummi Island Ferry. If we could move that to April, for example, the tourist traffic is significantly less, so we expect an increase in revenue. Right now, cash is transferred into the ferry fund rather infrequently. If we were to increase the frequency with which cash is transferred, we'd expect to see interest income on those transfers increase by about $2,000 a year. If we take all those recommendations and look at them, we end up with a $211,000 net reduction in expenses, a $66,000 increase in income, allowing about a $182,000 decrease in current user fees, and saving the road fund about $95,000 a year. That gives us a comparable case, this operations recommendations down here that you can compare to the original baseline case, where total cost is $2.45 instead of $2.67 million. We've generated $66,000 in new income. We have been able to reduce ferry user fees pretty substantially from 1.3 to about $1.1 million. And we've got the road fund cost under $1 million a year for the ferry. We also looked at some policy recommendations. These weren't tied to specific operational changes, but rather to either ordinance changes or other policies. For example, reintroducing our baseline case here for reference and our operations recommendations case. We recommend replenishing the cash reserve to the tune of $86,000 for 5 years. That would have to be generated by ferry user fees, of course, but that would allow us to rebuild and survive volatility, basically, in ferry ridership. We also recommend creating an island ferry taxing district. That would generate, we figure, about $184,000 in income that would allow us to reduce ferry user fares. We recommend moving the motor vehicle fuel tax deficit funding out of ferry user fees and into operations expenses. That will increase ferry user fees by $72,000, but it would save the road fund $72,000. Similarly, we recommend moving the motor vehicle fuel tax attributable funding out of the road fund and also into operations expenses. That would have basically an offsetting effect. The idea here is that the ferry, this puts everything cleanly into the ferry fund. The net effect of all those recommendations is a $98,000 increase in income, allowing a $103,000 decrease in ferry user fees at a cost of $5,000 to the road fund. If we were to implement all of those recommendations then, we'd be looking at net operating costs, expected net operating costs of $2.46 million, $164,000 in new income, just over $1 million in total required user fees, and still under $1 million out of the road fund. The question, of course, then arises, how do you generate the slightly over $1 million in fares? I guess you guys were in a position where you had to make that decision recently, and of course, the result was a $3 surcharge. And so we developed a tool, a simulation tool that we interacted with pretty frequently and sat down and held open houses with members of the community. And the idea was, how do you divide that $1.035 million in the least objectionable way? The truth is, nobody really is excited about paying $1 million, so the question then became, how do you come up with it in the least painful manner? So,
Can I interrupt for a second?
Yeah.
Just a clarification question. Can you go back to that slide? I'm trying to understand why your expenses column, why that's not equal to the sum of the other 3 columns.
comes back to, well, without going back all the way, it's on the budget baseline slide, total ferry expenses are expected to be $2.667 million. Total ferry income is expected to be $2.802 million. No, $2.682. There's a $16,000 delta between those two in the Public Works ferry budget. I expect, though I haven't verified this, I expect that $16,000 difference is attributable to an inevitable rounding issue. Basically, you can't generate ferry income that is exactly equal to ferry expenses because you can't charge $6.13.2 to go across the ferry. So the $16,000 difference is just taken directly from the budget.
But that's more, the difference between those 3, if you were to add them up, is more than...
Between these 3 numbers?
Yeah, the 3 on the right, the 164, you know, it's like...
It's 2169.
Right.
Plus
2455.
$160,000 in ferry deficit funding from
Okay,
the state.
so that's...
Plus $140,000 in attributable
Okay.
funding.
So
Plus
that's
$2,000.
the 300,000.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Yep. Yeah, we were just dealing with basically the flexible parts, the road fund and the ferry fund, presuming that contributions from the state stay stable.
Okay.
So we were interested in how we get to this $1.035 million. How do we distribute that among users? And apologizing to your optometrist in advance, at the top of this, we've got a target fare revenue of $1.03 million. We then listed every fare category that we came up with. So pedestrian cash, pedestrian multi-ride, needs-based pedestrian, child fares, etc. These are, in your book, you'll find a list of collapsed fare categories, new fare categories that we're recommending, some minor changes in the existing ones. These are those new categories. We then projected 2011 ridership based on what happened in the first few months of 2011 relative to 2010. It was basically a 12% reduction in vehicle with driver fare multi-ride passages and a 2% reduction in everything else. So recognizing that ridership is beyond our control, we took those changes in ridership, used that to build our simulation. We then allowed users to enter fares of their choosing, either based on a percentage discount or a firm override, to give us a round-trip fare per trip. We used the fare per round trip to come up with a total ticket price. So if one person goes across the boat once with a round-trip fare of $5, it's $5. But if they buy a 20-trip multi-ride ticket at $3 a trip, it's $60. We used those ticket prices and projected ticket sales to get total projected revenue by fare class based on the fares that community members input into those spots. That gave us, for every fare class, a total projected revenue. We then summed that up, and in this case, the fares selected generated $1.08 million in ticket revenue. We also gave users the opportunity to enter a summer surcharge. In this case, what we've got going on behind the scenes is a $2 surcharge on pedestrian and vehicle cash fares in summer months. That would generate $50,000. So the combination of what you see here on screen and the $50,000 would yield $1.1 million. The difference then between the fare target and projected fares is $93,000, meaning the set of fares here that we have entered into your booklets and that we developed with community members would generate $93,000 more than the fare box recovery requirement. The idea there is going into, we're using 2011 data. Going into 2012, we don't know exactly what happens. This gives us a pretty good amount of flexibility.
Excuse me, can you tell me where the simulation to assess fares is, what page number it's on in the book? I want to be able to read it, and I can't read any of that.
Fair enough. Off the top of my head, I don't know. Does anybody know that?
It's section D. If you go to the appendices tab and go to the very back of that tab, it's section D, and the explanation of that would be on pages 9, 10, 11, and 12. And unfortunately, page 12 did not end up being a color page, so to follow the verbal explanation, you need to go to page 14, where there is a color-coded one that ties into the verbal explanation on page 10.
Okay, for the record, that was an explanation from one of the task force members in the audience regarding the location of certain charts in the packet.
Thank you. That's exactly what we're looking at on screen right now. Just print it out. So bottom line, after sitting down and going through, this exercise many times at many different public meetings, the set of fares that we arrived at as a group with community input ended up generating even more revenue than we had targeted. In addition to the quantified recommendations, we came up with some non-quantified recommendations, process improvements, et cetera, that we couldn't tie specific dollar values to. One of the things that repeatedly came up was accounting transparency. One of the things that we would be good going forward is to record fare revenue at gross, rather than recording, say, discounted ticket prices, record ticket prices at gross, and then also record discounts from ticket prices. That makes subsequent accounting much easier in projects such as our own, and of course, say, for yourselves as well. There are some cost categories, such as the ERR fund, that require quite a bit of time to unpack. Turns out that some things like ferry fuel or certain fuel charges are deeply embedded in the ERR fund, which is fine as a non-accountant. It's just that it took quite a bit of time to figure out what was there. It's also worth noting that in the past, and maybe still at present, there's been a lot of discussion about various accounting changes made specific to the ferry. And it's worth noting that those appear to be consistent with standards. So specifically, the administrative allocations, the docks. Turns out that the other counties allocate their docks to operations as well. There were questions about capital versus maintenance. It turns out that the items that we looked at that had been categorized as capital were correctly categorized as capital. So it's worth pointing that out. There were no skeletons in the closet, as it were. At the same time, one of the other things that the exploration of accounting revealed was that the 45-55 split specified in the ordinance is in some sense slightly out of date. By that we mean the 55-45 split was based on the definition of operations that has correctly evolved to include other items. But the specification of the 55-45 was predicated on the original definition. So it's worth reevaluating that. Also, the 55-45 split creates some incentive issues. Specifically from the rider's perspective, capital is free. Operations are 55 cents on the dollar, but capital is free. And from the county's perspective, operations are 45 cents on the dollar, and every dollar of capital you have to pay in full. Which means that riders prefer to see capital expenses, and it's cheaper for the county to incur maintenance expenses. So an economic theorist would look at this and instantly say there's an incentives problem. One of the things that we encountered routinely, and we reflected on our quantified recommendations through electronic ticketing, was the level of technology. Right now, if we were to invest in something like electronic ticketing, we could better leverage existing human capital to generate reports for accounting purposes, to meet state reporting requirements, etc. So technology would offer some real advantages. One of the things that we had difficulty with was just locating the data that we wanted, because it exists basically in hard copy. For needs-based ticketing, we recommend standardizing eligibility using HUD criteria. So only one form of qualification. Right now there are three: Medicaid qualified, income qualified, and senior citizen with property tax exemption. We recommend standardizing those to one criteria, which is HUD very low income eligibility. And we recommend outsourcing that to the Opportunity Council, so that the Opportunity Council would qualify people rather than asking the treasurer to do that.
Can I just, one little question here? Did you ask the Opportunity Council if they do it?
I believe we did. Yeah. We also recommend reviewing the capital asset management plan, and when reviewing that, considering ferry system life cycle costs. This gets back to that comment that repairs have been increasing pretty dramatically recently. So to consider life cycle costs in the capital asset management plan. Also to consider flexibility. Right now we've got, one of the things that we recommend is when the docks are rebuilt, to expand the docks such that in an emergency, or if a new ferry is ultimately acquired, a different vessel can fit into the docks without major changes. Right now, one vessel will fit into those docks. That leaves us in a bit of a bind if that vessel fails or if that vessel's changed. As just an issue of convenience, we recommended that the vessel run at the same time every hour. Right now, the vessel runs 10 minutes before some hours, 10 minutes after some hours, and on the hour some hours from Lummi Island. That just makes it a little hard to remember. We recommend that children, everyone 18 and under, ride free. That's not currently how it's done. Right now, everyone 12 and under rides free. Students, resident students ride free while going to school, but not during summer. And there are like 4 or 5 different categories that children end up falling into, depending upon age, time of year, resident, non-resident, etc. Just to make things simpler, we recommended that all kids ride free. And finally, we recommended establishing a citizens advisory group routinely to address the types of issues that we've addressed here today. We did assess some things and reject them. We looked at cutting 2 hours of service in the middle of the day, and we found that midday traffic actually pays for operating expenses during those hours. We looked at imposing ticket expiration dates and found that there was widespread public opposition, and this creates an administrative burden. Not only do you have to either print new tickets or punch tickets with an expiration date, but the person on the boat, when it's rough out, still has to be able to see whether your ticket's valid or not. So it creates certain administrative hassles. We've recommended eliminating the Gooseberry Point parking lot. One alternative was to impose parking fees. That actually got a lot of public support. The problem is that it doesn't pay for itself. You would have to charge more to park than it would cost to drive across the boat in order to pay for the parking lot. We're basically done, but we wanted to thank the council, of course, for establishing us and taking the time to listen to us today. The Ferry crew for providing constant advice. The community, they helped us develop the set of fares, obviously, attended our meetings, gave us a place to stay. And I don't know if they're here, but I see Frank over there. I want to thank Frank and Chantel and Peggy from Public Works because they were routinely accessible throughout this entire process, went out of their way really to help us. So a big thank you to them. I think that's it.
Thanks, Chandler. Just following up to see if there are any questions that you have of Chandler or any of the rest of us.
Well, let's start at the end and move on down. Councilmember Brenner?
Well, I have a lot of questions, and so I don't want to hold things up. Before we go into questions from council members, before we go into questions from council members, would it be okay to get a little feedback from Frank or somebody from Public Works? Because some of I liked your recommendations, but I'm not sure they're all legal. And I just kind of wanted to hear from Public Works to see if they had any comments on them.
Good afternoon. Frank Abart, Public Works. Actually, at this point, I don't really have any comments. Okay. Certainly, I would like to thank them for going to all the hours of work that they did. I know based upon the number of hours we put in to providing them with data, it was probably times 10 or 20 what they had to do to work with that data. So I see a lot of good ideas. I see a lot of ideas that are going to need a little bit of review or a lot of review. To a certain degree, there's some level of conflict in a few things. And I'll just talk about the one that really stands out today, and that's the one about eliminating the parking lot. And of course, this comes at a time when I have been bombarded with emails and phone calls about eliminating a mere 100 positions for a 3-week period during dry dock. And so I'm not sure how well received the elimination of a parking lot is going to be received overall. However, we may not have a choice anyway because we don't own that lot. So at that point, I'll stop. This is your committee, and they did a great job, and we'll see where you want to go from there.
Director Abart, a quick clarification,
sure.
And it's sort of off topic to this, but because we all got those emails in the last couple of weeks, what was the reason for the elimination of the 95 spaces?
There wasn't specifically a reason. The Lummi Nation owns that, and for the last 3 or 4 years or so, we have had an agreement with them where they would allow us to utilize those extra parking spaces if we would do in-kind services for them, essentially mowing in certain areas and moving some boats around or equipment and things like that. So
And they weren't willing to do that this
They
year?
were not willing to do
So
that
that
this
was
year.
the reason why we have fewer spaces?
That's
Yes.
the reason.
Okay, okay.
Okay, I'm just going to ask one question, and especially before you go away, Frank. The mention, because I think it's a real good idea of reducing the amount of crew people needed. It was my understanding that the Coast Guard required a certain amount of people, and that's what we were doing. But could you clarify on that?
Yes, for the operation of the ship, the Coast Guard requires 3. It is my understanding that what is being suggested at this point is just during the startup in the morning, reduce the number of people on staff.
Okay.
So
So
I
that
need to get
might
more
be
details.
doable.
That may be okay, I'm not
Okay.
sure yet. Well, we'll talk about them as they come, I guess, but.
I have a question for Frank.
Okay.
Sorry, Frank. The motor vehicle fuel tax attributable that they have categorized there is that a number that you agree with, and that it is attributable?
It is a long-standing debate about how
Okay.
that's defined.
I had a feeling that
We
that
have a
was.
disagreement
Okay.
about
okay.
that.
I was wondering,
So-
that's what I was wondering, thanks.
And I have stated in meetings several times before that if they really want that in their budget, then I will be vigorously pursuing an equal offset to what our percentage of contribution is from the road fund. So,
Other questions, Councilmember Brenner?
Yeah, but why don't we go down the list?
Okay, Councilmember Knudsen?
Yeah, well,
Thank
it
you,
wasn't
Frank.
for Frank.
oh,
Okay.
It was for the committee, you know,
Okay.
I did
Very
mention
closer to-
I did make mention of the fact that in their history, they say that the Coast Guard wouldn't allow them to run on one engine, and that was one of the recommendations that they brought forward.
In the old days, the old
Sir, if
first.
you could state your name for the record,
Jim
please.
Dickinson.
Thank you.
Member of the committee here. In the old days, they ran with a single-engine ferry, and they'd have to go out and turn it around. When the Whatcom chief had a failure, they would just continue doing that. But since then, the Coast Guard will not allow a double-engine ferry to have an inoperable engine. When the ferry was dead in the 70s or in the 60s, there were parts all over the passenger cabin and oil dripping all over the place. It was dead. It was gone. It would not run. So today, the engine has to be available. It cannot be dead, but it has to be available. So if you want to run on one engine, you can. The other one just has to be ready to go if you need it. That's the difference. So it will be running, but it'll be idling and burning virtually no fuel.
Okay. And then my other question was for Chandler. You made mention in numerous times of reductions to the ferry fares. So are you proposing that we reduce the fares? Or was there any in your?
Yes, the set of fares, we have to go back a little ways. The set of fares that are up here now, that are too small to read, but are in your booklets, are lower than lower than or equal to current fares in all cases. That's made possible because of cutting the costs.
Okay, so was there any mention of reducing the road fund more and shifting some of that revenue back the other way?
Was there any mention of, so for example, changing the split from 55-45 to 60-40?
Well, just when I was watching, your numbers were a little different than what we have looked at in that as far as what the deficit is. I think, what did you have it at 1.06? And we've heard as high as 1.8. So that's where I was a little confused. Maybe Mr. Abart could.
I was confused about what you were asking is what I'm doing.
Well, in the beginning, when he was showing what the.
But that included capital, I think, too. Yeah, I think the number you're talking about is total cost, which is what we have to report to you guys, and that included capital expenditures as well. And that was like an average of 1.8 something million.
Yeah.
1.86?
Okay.
He's got it right off the top of his head there.
Yeah. Okay. So I guess that was confusion on my part.
Councilmember Larson.
Yes. First, I'd like to say that this group has completely exceeded my expectations in terms of what I expected to get from you. I think you guys did a fantastic job, and I know that you did it with no pay. I know that you had to come up with your own dollars to reserve the rooms that you met at, and really appreciate your work on that. And I just wanted to, you know, what would be really helpful is the reason that when the surcharge came forward, the reason I voted against the surcharge is because I think that there's, and it goes to Councilman Knutsen's sort of suggestion regarding what the rates are. And in economics, you know, there's a study of the elasticity of demand. And, you know, the econometric folks, they get together and they plug a bunch of numbers in, and what they're looking for is they're looking at what impact does a change in price have on total revenue. So, but the misnomer is a lot of people think that the only way that you're going to get additional total revenue is by increasing the prices. Well, that's not always true. And I think that what would be really helpful, Mr. Johnson, in this, and what I don't see and I don't know is, as I look at these ridership declines, knowing what ticket prices did relative to some of these declines. Because one of the examples, and I was asked to come back and speak to a economics class up at Western, and what the professor wanted me to do, and I thought it was actually fascinating to me, is because I'm not a real big math guy, but I understood the elasticity of demand, and I was trying to explain it to some students in a real simplified way, because we don't have always all the data, and it's very difficult, even once you get the data, to understand what impact it's going to have. But I used the real example. When I owned the Bellingham Bells Baseball Club, we operated for a number of years, and we were on an upswing in terms of total revenue. And then in 2007, I believe, we had a real challenge at the ballpark, and that was that the city, you know, started construction, and so our costs went up substantially. And so the first response that we had was, man, our costs are going up substantially. We're going to have to do something to recoup these costs. And the immediate thought was that you need to increase the cost of your hamburgers and everything else in your concession. But what we did is we did something different, and that is that we lowered the costs. And we lowered the costs, and because I sort of had this general idea of this elasticity of demand is how do you, the outcome isn't just to get more money out of everybody, it's to maximize total revenue. So if people are paying less per ticket, but total revenue is increased, then we win. And I think that in this situation, that's really what we're looking for. What we're missing is that you have to try it and really study some of these trends in order to figure out what to do. And if it doesn't work, you have to be prepared to adjust it. And so I guess I just say this because I think that a lot of what I'm hearing is that we need to, you know, there's the cost, we need more revenue, and the only way we're going to get it is by increasing prices. And I think that with further study, and I don't know if there might be a way to look at some of these trend lines, the ridership trend lines, and the ridership decline, and obviously there's the macroeconomic factors that you alluded to, and that's, you know, those are variables that can probably be, they can't be pulled out, they have to obviously be considered, but I think that there would be some value in pursuing this a little bit further and just looking at exactly what happened relative to the price changes. Because from what I understand, prior to November when I've been here, there's been a number of different changes over the years, and looking at some of that, I'm just not convinced that raising prices is the answer. I think that we need to look at how we're going to maximize total revenue, and that may very well, and just looking at some of these charts, clearly the trucks that would be vehicle cash, right? We see a major trend here. I'm looking at the ridership decline from 2007 and the green line that decreased by 40%. Clearly, you know, building is gone. Trucks aren't coming over. The contractors, et cetera, aren't coming over. But there's some of these other ones that actually, after 2007, you saw a little bit of an incline, right? So, and that would be there. You know, in fact, I'm looking at the passenger multi-ride, right, from 2007. We actually saw an increase into 2009. And so I think that there's some trends here that we could look at a little closer, and I just want to make sure that the first decision isn't that increasing rates is the only way to do it. So I'm really fascinated. I'd like to look more closely at the numbers that you used. And And I guess my question to you is, how did you get those numbers? Was that based on a survey on the island of what people could afford, or how did you get the numbers that you plugged into the simulation? Yeah.
Through community meetings. We'd sit there, all of our meetings were open, and in many of them we held, or in several of them in the spring, we held open houses where people from the community would come, and we would meet for 3 hours and talk about fares. And we'd go through the simulation and say, well, if we charge pedestrians only $4, then we still have to make up another $100,000 somewhere. Who's going to pay? So that's how we got those fares. In terms of the elasticities, you raise an interesting question that, as you might imagine, generates quite a bit of discussion on the island. Islanders would love it if cutting fares generated more revenue. I've got a study here, I was digging around in my bag. Thomas Adler performed a study for the Washington State Ferry System in 2010, end of 2009, beginning of 2010. Found that the price elasticity of demand for the Washington State Ferry System was about negative 0.2, which, if that number is less than -1, so like -4, you're going to lose money by raising fares. If it's less than if it's more than -1, excuse me, you'll make money by raising fares. So
because it'll increase total revenue.
Exactly. So for the Washington State Ferries in 2010, it was about -0.2. Not exactly comparable, different scale of operation. But there's an article published in by two academics at the Autonomous University of Barcelona in 2005, looked at 20 years of tolled highway usage in Europe, and cited at the end about 30 other studies conducted throughout the United States and Europe, and not a single one has price elasticity of demand for infrastructure that's less than -1. Almost always -0.2 to -0.3, where the biggest determinants of elasticity are the number of tourists and GDP growth. So I'd love it if price elasticity of demand for the Whatcom Chief were -2, because instantly what you'd want to do is cut ticket prices pretty significantly. And to your point about assessing the available data, you're exactly right. The issue that we have is we have a lot of observations of ridership, but we have very few observations of ridership and price changes. We can only observe a couple points. So ideally, as you noted, what we'd be able to do is tweak the fares quite a bit. In a simulated world, we'd tweak the fares a whole bunch, see how ridership changed, and then we'd know. Anyway, does that kind of answer the question?
Yeah, I think the point that I want to make is, maybe it's as much for our council members, and that is that I think clearly this is a challenge, and you guys have done a lot of work, and I think that we need to start thinking outside the box a little bit.
Okay, other questions, comments? Councilmember Mann.
Thanks. I have a few also. Just thanks to the committee. What a great job you did. And as we continue to have budget issues, I'm sure you've set a very high bar for us when we come up with other community committees where we have to outsource a lot of our research and analysis. It's really great. I'm very appreciative. Two things I was hoping you'd talk a little bit more about. Reducing the number of ferry runs. You mentioned, I guess, eliminating one run 4 days a week at 10:30. I think that was no, the last run would be at 12:30? 10:30? Well, either way, could you talk, you also in your report talked about eliminating runs in the middle of the day, but decided not to go that direction. Could you just talk about that discussion that you had and how you arrived at your decision and your recommendation?
Sure. Actually, what we recommended was, right now there is a 10 o'clock p.m. run, an 11 o'clock run, and a midnight run on every day of the week. We recommended adding a 10:20, so these are from times of departure from Lomi Island, adding a 10:20, eliminating the 11, and eliminating the 12, Sunday through Thursday. So 5 days a week, eliminating almost 2 hours of service at the end of the day. That's what we did recommend. What we recommended avoiding was eliminating 2 hours of service in the middle of the day. What we found is the traffic at the end of the day was so small that it didn't pay the cost to operate the ferry. Traffic in the middle of the day, on the other hand, is pretty substantial. And if you take, say, 2 hours out of the middle of the day, you actually have to, you have to take 3 hours out of the day to get a 2-hour service cut, because you still have to shut the boat down and start the boat up. So you'll end up losing revenue for 3 hours to get a 2-hour service savings. Does that make sense?
Like as far as labor and
Yeah.
stuff, okay.
Exactly. And what we found is that the traffic during even the 2-hour period paid for 2 hours of service. If you included the half hour on each end, but bookended that, then it overwhelmingly pays for ferry service.
It overwhelmingly pays for its 55% or for the whole thing?
For the whole thing. Yeah, it pays for, actually, I take that back. That's correct, yeah. Yeah, for total cost.
All right. I'll have to look into that some more. Can you also talk a little bit more about not including the capital costs in your analysis? Was that part of our charge to you, or was that just a decision you made as a group?
It was a decision we made as a group for several reasons. One of them is we were focusing on the ferry fund. Capital costs are not included in the ferry fund. We also, we were focusing on the ferry fund and budget items related to the ferry fund.
Because those are huge costs, huge costs. And would you guys mind forming again and looking at that too?
Yes.
Diane Harper, I'm a member of the task force. We noticed that in the resolution that you established us with, it said, consider the capital needs of the Lummi Island ferry system. And so we did look at capital. However, we don't have much expertise in it. So our recommendations on capital have to do with please investigate. We think there's a possibility that it might be good to look at a used boat instead of a new boat. The docks were mentioned, that instead of just repairing them, widen them.
Mm-hmm.
But all of those, we said, please get bids, or please investigate further, because that's just not something that we know much about.
Okay. Any further questions?
I just had one more comment regarding the elasticity of demand. You know, a Bell's ticket is a discretionary expenditure, you know. As we've heard from these folks a lot, this is not discretionary. They absolutely depend on this. So I would imagine a ferry system, especially this one, I guess it would be inelastic demand. I mean, they rely on it desperately.
Maybe during the summer.
During the summer.
You know, do I take my kids over and versus I don't if it's $8, but if it's only $4? Yeah, maybe we.
Yeah.
Councilmember Weimer?
Yeah, I just wanted to thank the group. I mean, it was an amazing amount of work you put in, and the presentation today was very clear. I wish a lot of the presentations we got here in this chambers were as easy to understand as Mr. Johnson. As Mr. Johnson did. It was good. I think one of the problems the council is going to have to struggle with is this whole, you talked about incentives, disincentives for the capital versus the operations, and you know, I see that you looked at creating a ferry district, but all of that would go towards the operations. And I think some of the push we're hearing is that if we created a ferry district, some of that should go towards the capital. So I'm glad you kind of highlighted that, and that's going to be an issue we'll probably need to struggle with, and we're probably going to have more discussions with folks out on the island about that. So, thank you.
I think at this point, we've got another meeting coming up here at 1:30, so from the administration, maybe we're not meeting again till September, but maybe at some point in Councilmember Brenner's Public Works Committee, if we could kind of have a vetting of this report and this information and further discussion. Is that, Councilmember Brenner, where you'd like to take this? Or?
Yeah, no, that would be fine. And I just wanted to say thank you. I attended, I think, a couple of the meetings, and I was so impressed. Not only did they all work together well, but this has got to be one of the most diverse committees we've ever set up. And I'm real impressed with you guys. Thank you.
Okay. And with that, Councilmember Kirshner has a presentation she'd like to make.
Well, I just wanted to thank the committee and let everybody know that I am absolutely not surprised at the wonderful amount of work that they did. I attended their first meeting. This is a group of people that got themselves organized right away, determined what their tasks would be, and got down to work. They also did a wonderful job of including the community and took public input at every meeting, sometimes throughout the meeting. Did a great job of communicating with each other on email, and I might can attest to that since I got all their emails for the last 7 months. And so what I would like to do is present you each with a certificate of appreciation from the County Council. So I'll read your names, and if you would like to come up, we'll start with Miss Kathy Berg. And this is a certificate of appreciation is presented to Kathy Berg. The Whatcom County Council sincerely thanks you for your service as a member of the Lummi Island Ferry Task Force. Mr. Jim Dickinson. Miss Patricia Dunn. Miss Diane Harper. Mr. John Chandler Johnson. Miss Barbara Ryan. And Mr. Riley Starks, who wasn't able to make it today, we will put this in the mail to him. And I also wanted to give a special thank you to Miss Barbara Ryan for chairing the committee and doing such a wonderful job. Thanks.
And like we said, stay tuned. I think coming this fall, we will take up some of these recommendations and take a little bit more closer look at some of them and get some feedback from the administration on implementation. With that, the Committee of the Whole is adjourned, and we'll be reconvening, the Council Committee will be reconvening as the Public Works Committee in a few minutes.